So we've got another question come up on one of the videos, which is a really difficult situation that the person's in. Essentially what's happened is they've fled domestic abuse, they've fled a significant distance away from their home area, and essentially what's happened is they've just been plonked in the middle of nowhere, they don't know anyone, and they've become very isolated. And the question they've asked is, if I left this property and returned to my home area, would I be found intentionally homeless? And so I'm going to talk a bit about intentional homelessness in general, but I will try to answer this question. And unfortunately, it's one where the law is just about okay and the practice is very, very difficult. So essentially, assuming that you've fled an area, you're now in settled accommodation, so you have a tenancy, but you're now isolated and that's having a significant impact on your mental health, it is possible to basically approach a different council and not be found intentionally homeless, but it's quite a high, it's kind of called a high hurdle within housing law to actually to do that. So in order to do it legally, in theory, you need to demonstrate that you have a disability. So for in this case, it could be depression, and that would be evidenced through a GP or kind of, maybe other support service. And ultimately, the property needs to be having a significant impact on that person's disability. It needs to be making it significantly worse, which again, realistically in the real world, you're going to need probably, doctor's evidence. Now, there's a case which I've talked about in other videos, which was Lomax v Gosport, which was not a completely dissimilar case, where essentially a lady with very significant mobility issues was confined to a home, and her family all lived 60 or 70 miles away. And actually she was able to approach the council where her friends and family were without abandoning her home, by essentially saying that even though, yes, I do have a home, it's not reasonable for me to continue to occupy because of the impact this isolation's having on my mental health. So again, in that case, the GP was writing very, very clear documented evidence to say, Miss Lomax has depression and it's very, it's having a substantial impact on her day-to-day living activities, therefore it's a disability, and living in this property is making it significantly worse. So as I say, it's one of the few areas in homelessness law where it's quite a high hurdle to cross. So that's the kind of the theory. So in theory, the answer to the question is yes, you could approach a different council. What I'd say is that you do not, you don't end your tenancy in doing that. You approach a different council whilst you still have a tenancy in that other area, and you make the argument. You don't say I'm homeless because I don't have a roof over my head. You say I'm homeless because I do have a roof over my head, but it's just not suitable for me. It's not reasonable for me to continue to occupy. So you could do that. In the real world, the council is likely, the council you're approaching is likely to dig their heels in and not help you. So ultimately what I'd be saying to someone in that situation is get legal advice very soon. Find that, if you're on benefits, you'll be eligible for legal aid, but you need to find a solicitor who can take legal aid kind of, contracts or whatever for homelessness cases, and do it with a solicitor, because this is, I'm a layperson, I'm not a solicitor, but we've only made this argument successfully a couple of times in the years of casework we've done, and that was backed up by very significant evidence from psychiatrists or whatever about the impact it was having on them. So that's kind of what I would say. Now that doesn't, there may be other housing options as well. So maybe if you approached a council, they wouldn't be rushing to help you, but if you were able to find private rented accommodation, they may help you with a deposit or first month's rent. They're more likely to do that than to put you onto a housing register, I think. But that's kind of that's really the kind of consideration you'd have. And ultimately, unfortunately, I can't give you a lot of positive news really. The reality is you're going to have to get quite lucky with a competent advocate who's willing to fight for that change with you. Many of the services, sad to say, many of the domestic abuse services I know probably wouldn't have that combination of detailed understanding of the homelessness kind of legislation and the ability to stand up to a council and kind of dig their heels in and kind of fight back.